just because we just have 1 hour and we want to respect everyone's times for side events. My name is Méline Schwarzberg. I'm a Women and Gender Project Manager at the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which is a network of more than 180 organizations worldwide committed to the abolition of the death penalty. And I'm very happy to moderate today's event, which is organized by Reprieve and the World Coalition, and also a lot of co-sponsors that you can see on the slides. Today we're going to speak about a very important but often overlooked topic, which is the reality of women and LGBTQ plus people exposed to the death penalty. For many years, the abolitionist movement underlooked the topic of women and LGBT plus people, as women represent a low portion of people on death row, and as we have no or limited data on gender minorities on death row, during a lot of time, it was not something we were speaking about. But in 2021, with World Day Against the Death Penalty, which is observed each 10 October, the abolitionist movement started working on this topic. And since 2022, with the support of the Canadian and French governments, the World Coalition has been leading a project aimed at giving visibility to the reality of women and LGBTQ plus people exposed to the death penalty, with the main objective to obviously reinforce their protection, but also to reinforce the narrative showing that the death penalty is a discriminatory and human tool and that it should be abolished. So for today's conversation, we're going to have an exceptional group of experts, some of them being in person and some of them being online. And when they're going to speak, I will share the video. And to start, I would like to introduce briefly the panelists. So Bahar Mirhosseni, it's a human rights and criminal defensor and senior legal fellow director of legal advocacy at the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty worldwide. She represented thousands of marginalized people impacted by the criminal justice system in the US, and also partnered with legal and human rights defenders across the Middle East, Africa, and the US. And Bahar is actually the co-chair of the gender working group at the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Then we have Duaa Dhainy online, which is the senior researcher at the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. She documents human rights violation in Saudi Arabia, focusing on the death penalty and arbitrary detention. And she contributes to international advocacy, including at the UN level. Then we have Jaipreet Kaur, which is the Reprieve project lead for Southeast Asia here in the room. She supports people facing the death penalty, including trafficking survivors and those with mental health needs. She trained in international human rights laws and has worked with UNHCR and civil society groups in Malaysia and Geneva. And then we have the pleasure to have with us Susan Kigula, which is an Uganda lawyer and global anti-death penalty advocate. Susan is a former death row prisoner, now leading a center for children of incarcerated women in Uganda. And she's an upstanding member of the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women. So I'm going to switch off this PowerPoint to make sure we can see the participants, just checking if it's going to work. So my first question will be to Susan. First, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Susan's participation for being there with us, and we would have liked her to be in person, but it has been complicated for visa issues and limited time to organize this. But we also want to recognize and highlight the importance in having women impacted by the criminal justice system in the room when we speak about abolitionist and prison reform efforts. And just to highlight that this responsibility was properly echoed in the resolution adopted in May 2025 at the 34th session of the Crime on Commission, Prevention and Criminal Justice, which for the first time explicitly recognized the role of individuals with lived experience when it comes to prison reform. So the first question is for you, Suzanne. Could you tell us more about your stories and discrimination you experienced in the death penalty process, but also after? And then we hope it's going to work.
Thank you, Meline. I'm so very, very happy and privileged to be part of this, despite the fact that miles away in Uganda. Just like you said that we weren't able to secure a visa because of the limited time, but that cannot stop us from, doing what we are doing right now. I am Susan Kigula, a former death row prisoner in Uganda who spent 16 years in prison and 14 of those on death row. I was sentenced to death in 2002 after being found guilty of the murder of my boyfriend and the father of my daughter. We weren't married, though the media portrayed it that way. I still maintain my innocence because truth is I'm not the one who killed him. I too survived narrowly over the same attack. That fateful night, he died. I still painfully carry both physical and emotional scars for the wounds inflicted upon me by the assailants who murdered my man and what I had to endure for 16 years in prison. For all those years I was incarcerated, I went through a non-describable amount of trauma, depression, anxiety, fear. I lost a lot of weight. I lost my dignity and self-worth. I knew that I wasn't a criminal and determined to fight the powers of oppression. I studied law from prison, and with the legal knowledge that I acquired, I was able to help my fellow inmates with basic legal interpretation of their cases and train them in self-representation, wrote their memorandums of appeal by identifying for them the best grounds for their appeals. And I trained them on how to mitigate their cases in case of a guilty verdict to get lesser sentences. Pardon me for the cock. I led a famous case known as the Susan Kigula and 417 others that changed the Ugandan laws by constitutionally abolishing mandatory death sentences. I saw many women get justice, others get released quicker than it would be without my support, and witnessed the death row inmates have another chance in life as they were too released. Going to a question of gender-based discrimination in capital punishment. Gender-based discrimination is a significant concern in capital punishment. Women face intersectional discrimination throughout the judicial process, leading to capital punishment like the death penalty. Women from ethnic and racial minorities, those with mental disabilities, the LGBT communities, are disproportionately discriminated against. In an African setup, when a woman is in conflict with the law, the public outcry outweighs justice. It is considered a taboo for a woman to face the judge or to go to a court, and she is considered the greatest sin of all, hence affecting justice and a fair trial. Law enforcement agencies always display gender bias, affecting fairness in trials and sentencing. Women with babies have been sentenced to capital punishment or the death penalty, which is not the case with men. History of gender-based violence towards the woman is not considered during sentencing. We have seen that in a prison, there is lack of employment for women. There is a lot of sexual abuse of formerly incarcerated women in exchange for work or getting a job. Families usually turn against the wife after incarceration and she's sent off to nowhere. Funders and donors rarely support women groups of formerly incarcerated only because they see them as the greatest aggravators. Single motherhood is inevitable as the husbands remarry and sent away the woman with her children after incarceration. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you a lot, Suzanne. And yeah, thank you for sharing with us your very important story and also for giving us light and for informing us about this very important topic. And following on what you just mentioned, Suzanne, I would like to ask Bahar. So Bahar is from the Cornell Center, and as mentioned, they did studies to identify the gender bias at work in capital punishment. So I would like to ask you, Bahar, following Suzanne's testimony, could you share the main highlights of the study done by the Cornell Center in 2018? Thank you.
In 2018, when the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide published Judged for More Than Her Crime, there was an estimated 500 women on death rows around the world. These are estimated numbers because of the enormous challenges in accessing women on death row and data about them. Lack of transparency, governmental interests in hiding human rights violations are included in these challenges. Now, about 7 years later, in 2025, in the context of accelerated criminalization of women, it is estimated that there are more than 1,000 women on death rows around the world. As of February 2024, there were 44 cis women, 6 trans women, and 1 trans man on death rows in the United States. These cases are characterized by a history of gender-based violence that is disregarded, intersectional injustice, and proceedings replete with gender biases. Globally speaking, in 2024, Iran executed at least 31 women, marking the highest annual number in 17 years, according to our colleagues at Iran Human Rights NGO. Since 2025 began, Iran has executed 16 women. But even if there was just 1 woman on death row in the entire world, that case would mean everything, not just because capital punishment must be abolished, but also because of the ways in which women are sentenced to die is so deeply linked to gender injustice. At the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide, we have a database that is updated on the death penalty laws around the world, and we maintain an execution monitor that is updated on a weekly basis. We do not have numbers for China because of state secrecy around capital punishment. Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are currently the worst in terms of judicially ordered executions. However devoid of due process those judicially ordered executions are. As a human rights lawyer, to talk about the dehumanization inherent in the death penalty, we cannot forget the racism and dehumanization at the core of Israel's ongoing US-backed genocide in Gaza that has resulted in the killing of more than 55,000 Palestinians, including the destruction of hospitals, homes, scholasticide, and a manufactured forced starvation in a global context where, especially on university campuses in the United States, efforts to oppose a genocide peacefully through speech and protest has been suppressed, brutalized, and criminalized. In a context of accelerated criminalization of women, the ways in which women are sentenced to die rely on patriarchal norms in a context of intersecting injustices, weaponization of gender biases, and suppression of women's human rights activism, and the discounting of the role of trauma and gender-based violence in the lives of survivors. And this is one of the reasons why abolition of the death penalty is a feminist issue.
Thank you, Bahar. And so to go more deep in this question of gender bias discrimination at work in capital punishment, I would like to ask Jaipreet about the situation in Southeast Asia, knowing that most of the women sentenced to death are sentenced to death for drug-related offenses.
Thank you so much, Meline, and thank you everyone for coming. We're really grateful to see you all here in person and online. I think Bahar and Susan, have highlighted a lot of the overarching factors which contribute to the specific situations of women facing the death penalty. And yeah, I'll speak a little bit about Southeast Asia specifically and drug offences, or the death penalty for drug offences. Foreign nationals are, in general, overrepresented on death rows worldwide. In Malaysia, there is a huge proportion of foreign nationals, which exceeds the proportion within the general population. There's also a larger, or a comparatively larger, number of women on death row in Malaysia as compared with the rest of the world. In 2020, I think Malaysia had 16% of the world's women who were facing the death penalty. And so as a subset of foreign nationals, migrant workers are overrepresented on death row in Southeast Asia. So as you mentioned, there are these intersecting factors which increase the vulnerability of women or increase the risk of women facing the death penalty, particularly if they are foreign nationals or migrant workers. These factors include general exploitation of migrant workers. So quite often we see people being trafficked for work in Southeast Asia, among Southeast Asian countries. So prior to the abolition of the mandatory death penalty, which I know we'll talk about soon, we saw that there was the biggest proportion of women on death row in Malaysia were foreign nationals. I think it was over 90%. And they were all from Thailand, Iran, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So you can see that there is a sort of regional trafficking issue. And as Meline said, they're mostly on death row for drug trafficking. And drug trafficking is a form of trafficking. That is something, that's a link that we really emphasize in our work. Women are particularly vulnerable to drug trafficking operations and syndicates. They are generally or quite often targeted by organized syndicates. We also see quite sophisticated trafficking methods, sometimes love scams, sometimes other forms of discrimination are at work. Once somebody is arrested and they are a woman, they or somebody from the LGBTQI+ community, they will face more discrimination and quite specifically gendered abuse from authorities. So we recently were working with somebody who, at the time of her arrest, was kind of abused with very gendered slurs by the authorities who arrested her for drug trafficking. And then all of this is kind of compounded by the fact of being a foreign national and not having the correct or the same support networks that a national would have in terms of finding legal representation, in terms of navigating an already oppressive and complex criminal justice system. So we see this across Southeast Asia. This is why consular assistance is a really, really important factor in reducing the risk of facing the death penalty, particularly for foreign nationals and, as a subset, migrant workers who are women.
Thank you a lot, Jaipreet. And to continue a bit exploring the specific discrimination that foreign national women are facing, we're gonna back to online colleagues, and I'm gonna ask Duaa about the situation in Saudi Arabia. So Duaa, the floor is yours.
Hi, Milan. Hi, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to raise these serious concerns about the implementation of the death penalty against women in Saudi Arabia in general and the foreign nationals specifically. I was hoping to be in person with you and to see you all, but due to the unfortunate circumstances in the Middle East, I was not able to attend. Sorry for this also. I'll try just to give you a general about the situation in Saudi Arabia in general, and we can discuss more about the situation. In Saudi Arabia, women sentenced to death face systemic and discrimination. First, as women who are judged under a legal and cultural system rooted in patriarchal norms. Second, as foreign nationals who often lack access to legal counsel, interpreters, consular support, and are denied of a fair chance to defend themselves. Over the past 5 years, we have documented executions of women for both murder and drug-related cases in Saudi Arabia. In 2020, one Saudi woman faced murder charges had been executed. In 2021, also one Saudi woman. In 2022, one Ethiopian woman also for murder. In 2023, 6 women had been executed, 3 Saudis, 1 from Ghana, 1 from Yemen, 1 from Bangladesh. In 2024, 9 women had been executed, 3 Saudis, 1 Ethiopian, 1 Kenyan, and 4 Nigerian women. What is particularly alarming in 2024 is the execution of 4 Nigerian women for drug-related charges, which marks the first recorded executions of women for drug offenses in the kingdom. All 4 women were of Nigerian nationality, a country from which many women come to Saudi Arabia for domestic work. This raises credible suspicions that they may have been victims of human trafficking or was forced to transporting drugs with no proper investigation into their status as potential victims. This marks a dangerous shift in Saudi Arabia's application of capital punishment, extending it to new categories on vulnerable women, with no transparency or accountability in the process. Data published by the Ministry of Interior through official news agencies shows that in the past 2 years, 98 people were executed for drug offenses, including 69 foreign nationals. So most of them are foreign nationals. 11 Asian and African countries. These sentences were all ta'zir punishments, meaning they are left for judges' interpretation. From 2010 to 2021, executions of foreign nationals for drug offenses were 3 times as many as Saudi nationals. The UN Committee of Elimination of Racial Discrimination expressed concerns over this pattern, warning of targeting the non-Saudis. In this context, the usage of death penalty represents a double violation: gender-based discrimination against women and nationality-based discrimination against foreign workers, often from migrant communities. All this is depending on the official data, but unfortunately, we have a data problem in Saudi Arabia. There is a major concern in the complete absence of transparency around women facing capital punishment. There is no public access to case files or verdicts, no independent monitoring of detention conditions, no systemic consular notification, no clarity about cases, access to legal representation. We documented the case of one Italian hostess who was arbitrarily detained during a mass anti-drug sweep. She was held in women's prison in Tabuk, I think, or Jeddah, where she witnessed firsthand the poor conditions of detention, overcrowded cells, lack of hygiene supplies and clean clothes, denial of basic health and sanitation needs, lack of contact with the outside world. A further layer of curiously arises is cases involving mother, pregnant women, breastfeeding detainees. In Saudi Arabia, there is no public information or legal regarding the execution of women in such condition. We don't know whether their health, parental status, mental being is taken into account, if at all. In such cases, the death penalty becomes more and more inhuman, and its consequences are more far-reaching. We must underline that in 2025, there had been an escalation in the executions in Saudi Arabia in general. Till today, we have 154 executions, one for women, and the charge is for kidnapping and kidnapping children. Until now, we don't have the exact number of women in death row, but we think that the number is very high.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you a lot, Duaa, for sharing about the situation in Saudi Arabia and also for highlighting these very important points. I think that both Duaa and Jaipreet highlighted a very interesting point regarding to what extent women are targeted, for example, in drug-related cases by drug traffickers, also because very often they are at the low level in drug trades. And you may have heard about a very public case in 2010, a woman from Philippines, Mary-Jane Veloso, that was targeted by drug traffickers, and that she thought she was finding a job, but then she transported drug without knowing it. So I think that these cases are also very important, and I think both also linked with what Suzanne mentioned, highlighted the impact of isolation as a migrant person, but also the isolation as woman because of stigma. And I think that Suzanne explained it very well. So I would like now to ask to Bahar about another main reason for why women are sentenced to death, which is for the crime of murder, where we can see in a very important and clear way the impact of gender-based discrimination.
So my response here draws extensively from the research led by our faculty director at the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide, Sandra Babcock. Women are underprotected as victims and over-prosecuted as perpetrators. Gender-based violence is a pathway for women to their death sentences. Yet by the time they are charged with capital crimes, they are no longer viewed as victims or survivors. Instead, their experiences of violence are papered over in a system that views them solely as perpetrators. By neglecting to consider the impact of gender-based violence, courts risk punishing women for the direct consequences of their trauma. In the United States, Melissa Lucio was 6 years old the first time she was sexually abused. By the time Miss Lucio was sentenced to death in Texas in 2008, she had survived 2 violent intimate partners and given birth to 12 children. When male officers interrogated her following the death of her daughter, who actually died from a head injury suffered in a fall, Miss Lucio was still in shock. Exhausted and overwhelmed after 5 hours of being yelled at, berated, and pressured, Miss Lucio acquiesced and stated, "I guess I did it." It was not a confession, it was a submission, the survival response of a woman conditioned by a lifetime of abuse. Years of being beaten, sexually assaulted, and silenced had taught Miss Lucio that survival meant compliance. Yet instead of recognizing how trauma shaped her response, prosecutors fought to erase her past, objecting to expert testimony that could have explained this profound impact of lifelong gender-based violence. In October 2024, a Texas court found that Miss Lucio was actually innocent. Nevertheless, to this day, she remains on death row, pending review by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. And Miss Lucio's story is shared here today because it is not unique. In the United States, amongst women on death row, at least 96% of them have experienced gender-based violence. Of these women, nearly 90% had experienced sexual or physical violence. and more than 80% have experienced some form of psychological abuse. Yet at their trials, the trauma was either discredited or actively used against them. For women of color in the United States, gender-based violence as a pathway to death row is even more prevalent. All but one of the Black women currently on death row in the United States has endured multiple and repeated forms of gender-based violence before their incarceration, and most also experienced abuse as a child. Every single Latina, Native American, and Asian woman currently on death row in the United States has experienced multiple incidents of gender-based violence. And nearly every woman of color on death row in the United States was abused as a child. And this is important because courts and legal systems in the United States and around the world must recognize and acknowledge survivors of gender-based violence, first and foremost, primarily as survivors, rather than criminalizing people for the trauma that they have experienced and endured.
Thank you a lot, Bahar. And also here to highlight that the situation that Bahar highlighted, it's very, like it's a pathway that we can identify worldwide. And I think that Cornell show it in a very interesting way in their studies. I think the last point you made about the fact that this is not recognized by jurisdiction is very important, including in case where women kill their abusive partner. This is not utilized by courts. So linked with this, I would like to ask to Jaipreet regarding the question of mitigating circumstances in Kaur. Very often the history of women, including past history of trauma, economic pressure, are not taken into consideration, but we can see some good example of country where mitigating circumstances can be recognized, and this shows us to what extent this is important. So I think that Jaipreet, if you can speak to us about the situation in Malaysia, this would be amazing.
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks also to Bahar for outlining the sort of global factors of discrimination and those intersecting issues which, as we spoke about earlier, increase the risk of somebody ending up on death row or women ending up on death row, and then, you know, not being able to come off it or struggling with continued discrimination. So I will just take a small step back from your question on mitigation and talk about the fact that Malaysia abolished the mandatory death penalty very recently. And as a result, everybody who was on death row prior to the abolition of the mandatory death penalty was given the opportunity for a review of their death sentence and to replace their death sentence with an alternative sentence. So we at Reprieve, together with many partner organizations, conducted quite a detailed data review of all people who were resentenced. And we recorded cases of, I think, approximately, well, not the full data set of people who were resentenced, but quite a big data set. And we know that there were 103 women on death row prior to the resentencing process, and now there are only 3. So this has been a huge step forward in terms of reducing the death row population. And I won't speak specifically about the resentencing process now because we're going to talk about mitigation instead. And already Bahar and Susan and Duaa have referred to this question of taking into account the specific circumstances of women facing the death penalty and how those should actually mitigate against receiving a death sentence. This wasn't possible in Malaysia before the mandatory death penalty was abolished because there was no discretion afforded to the courts to take mitigating circumstances into account and to hand down an alternative sentence. So it's important to talk about mitigation because of to have a criminal justice system that functions properly, you need to have a sense of proportionate sentencing. There should be a range of sentences available to the court to hand down depending on the nature of the offence, the particular circumstances of the person being tried, etc., etc. So everything that you raised, Bahar, and the other panelists have raised should be taken into account, and that includes gender-based violence and the specific circumstances that contribute to women being targeted by drug traffickers, being trafficked, being discriminated against, and the very specific gendered abuse that many women within the criminal justice system face. And that discrimination often persists from the moment of arrest to during detention to upon release, as you mentioned. So these all should be considered mitigating factors, and it's really, really important that the Malaysian criminal justice system takes that into account in this kind of new phase of sentencing in capital cases.
Thank you a lot, Jaipreet. And still linked with the process linked with the death penalty, I would like to ask Bahar regarding the specific topic of gender bias in capital punishments and in sentencing.
So I will speak about the Brenda Andrew U.S. Supreme Court decision, the case of Lemmy Lembu in Tanzania, and the situation in Iran. In January, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in the case of Brenda Andrew. At Brenda Andrews' 2004 murder trial in Oklahoma for her husband's murder, the prosecution heavily relied on gender stereotypes to portray her as an unfit mother and an immoral woman. Witnesses were called to testify about her provocative clothing and her past sexual relationships, questioning whether, for example, a good mother would behave or dress the way that she did. The prosecutor in front of the jury opened a suitcase displaying Miss Andrews' underwear, lacy underwear, to dehumanize her and question the sincerity of her grief. This is in her capital trial. The prosecutor waved her underwear in the air in front of the jury. Research led by our faculty director, Sandra Babcock, Professor Sandra Babcock, and a lawyer for Brenda Andrew, contextualizes this type of gender bias in capital trials. In reviewing the cases of nearly 50 women on death row in the United States across various state jurisdictions, we've established that juries were allowed to consider women's sexual histories, their failings as mothers, their choices of intimate partners, and female wickedness in deciding how to punish them. Then, on January 21st this year in 2025, in Andrew v. White, the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court issued this landmark decision, recognizing for the first time that the prosecutor's gender-biased arguments at the trial for Brenda Andrew may have undermined the fairness of that capital trial and violated due process. The court then remanded the trial to the lower court, the appeals court, to decide whether the evidence was so prejudicial that it violated her due process rights. Turning to the case of Lemmy Lembu and the request for an advisory opinion that is under consideration. In March 2025, 24 international human rights organizations submitted an amicus to the African Court of Human and People's Rights on gender injustice and the death penalty. And this gender justice amicus on the death penalty featured Miss Lembu, a survivor of gender-based violence and a person with an intellectual disability who has languished on death row in Tanzania in a life that has been shaped by gender-based oppression. The gender injustice amicus was submitted in support of a 2024 request for an advisory opinion submitted by the Pan-African Lawyers Union, seeking a landmark opinion by the African Court of Human and People's Rights, declaring that the death penalty is incompatible with the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. Turning to Iran. Amidst an unconscionable scale, mass scale of executions, women's rights activists in Iran continue to be targeted, criminalized, and face lethal consequences for speaking out. In this context, the struggle for girls' and women's human rights in Iran, led by Iranian women, is inseparable from the global movement to abolish the death penalty. 3 prominent women's rights activists in Iran are on death row and imminently at risk of execution. Their names are Sharifeh Mohammadi, a labor activist, Pakshkan Azizi, a Kurdish humanitarian worker, and Varisha Moradi, a women's rights activist, who are all also part of the No to Death Penalty Tuesdays anti-death penalty campaign. That's the name of the campaign, No to Death Penalty Tuesdays. And that's a campaign that began by prisoners in Iran's prisons. And that campaign this week is now in its 74th week. And there are people who are in prison in Iran from 47 different prisons across the country that are part of this No to Death Penalty Tuesdays campaign. Prior to Israel's missile strikes on Iran, data reported by our colleagues at the Iran Human Rights NGO, a member of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, established the devastating fact that over a period of 8 months and 10 days between 2024 and 2025, there were over 1,020 executions, which means that there was an execution during that period in Iran every 6 hours, a judicially ordered execution every 6 hours.
Thank you. Thank you a lot, Bahar. And in interest of time, I just want to be able to speak briefly about, to recognize the fact that since the beginning, we mainly spoke about women facing death penalty. But I wanted to highlight that when we speak about gender, discrimination women and LGBTQ plus people are facing, it's important to recognize that 12 countries still retain the death penalty for consensual same-sex activities, but also that they can be targeted by other type of offenses, such as corruption on earth in Iran. And I think that Bahar explained it a bit, and we could provide more information also at the end, but also that they are facing specific discrimination in the death penalty process, including in detention. We don't have time to go more in deep, but we want to recognize that this reality exists and that more data is needed. And on this, I just wanted to briefly ask Jaipreet about a specific case in Malaysia, just to highlight a bit and give visibility to this situation.
So much. Yeah, as you said, I think this is, gender and the death penalty is a broader issue than just women or cis women. And I want to talk about the case of Pao, who is a trans woman who's only 33 years old. And she was arrested about 12 years ago in 2013 for drug trafficking in very similar circumstances to what we've discussed before. She was trafficked, she was arrested, and she's been gendered as a man. Malaysia has not recognized her gender identity, and she's being detained in a male prison. She contracted tuberculosis while in prison, and she's currently unable to walk, so she's also disabled. And the reason we talk about this case is that there is evidence of gender discrimination, transphobia, etc., intersecting discriminations from the moment that she was arrested until now during her detention. She was on death row until last year, when she was resentenced to the sentence of 30 years imprisonment and whipping. Whipping is a sentence that is an alternative sentence to the death penalty in Malaysia, and the only people who can be exempted at the time of sentencing are women and men above the age of 50. It is possible to seek an exemption once you are sentenced on health grounds, but that is not a judicial process necessarily. It's a sort of administrative process, and you sort of appeal to the prison authorities and the kind of outside the court, a system where you sort of adduce evidence of somebody's medical condition in order to seek an exemption from whipping. So Pau was sentenced to whipping. She was not exempted on the basis she was a woman. And she was also not exempted on the basis of her extensive injuries. She was wheeled into court on a stretcher. It was very, very obvious that she wouldn't have qualified for a sentence of whipping, but the court was unable to dispense with the sentence of whipping at the time of sentencing. Thanks to our partner organizations and to Pau's lawyer and, to Pau herself, who has demonstrated incredible, unimaginable resilience in the work that she has done to keep herself alive in these terrible conditions. She has been exempted from the sentence of whipping now, but it's just, a case where you can very, very clearly see the effects of gender discrimination from the beginning of the case until now. She remains in prison because her sentence hasn't been completed. But yeah, I hope that kind of illustrates all the issues that we're kind of talking about, and as well as the cases that you've raised as well.
Thank you a lot, Jaipreet. And now, before we hope having some time for question, I would like to go a bit on good practices. So I'm going to ask Bahar, and after Duaa. Bahar, I'm going to, if you can, as a human rights lawyer, if you could share with us some key effective practices.
So in approaching this work, I mean, this could be a whole separate long discussion, but just as some headlines here, a trauma-informed approach through an intersectional gender justice lens, being guided by the expertise of people who are survivors of gender-based violence, survivors of mass incarceration, or survivors, for example, of being accused of a capital offense. Just as some examples of what we mean by survivors, shifting power to those who have been most robbed of power, most structurally robbed, institutionally robbed of power, of systemic power. And Malene, we're going to turn the tables here. As Women and Gender Project Manager and as my co-chair of the Gender Working Group at the World Coalition, I also want to ask you the same question.
So yeah, we just wanted to share very quickly some key tips in terms of what we learned with this project. First is that advocating for the reality of women and LGBTQ plus people helps giving visibility to the fact that the death penalty should be abolished because it's discriminatory, and the reality of this person help building this narrative. But also it helps us identify new entry points when it comes to advocacy, and we engage a lot with the CEDAW committee. And we have been able to have access to new information, new data, but also to have the experts engaging with the states on the topic. And finally, another point is the importance in building connection with women's rights and LGBTQ plus rights organization, identifying new allies. And very quickly, I want to share a guide that we developed on how to implement gender-responsive international advocacy, where you can find specific tips on this topic. And if you want a digital copy, you can write us. But before closing, I would ask quickly Duaa, if you could share with us some good practices and why this work is important according to you.
Thank you, Malene. Of course, I'll try to just say points about the good practices that yes, HR that is working in an environment as Saudi Arabia, some place that it's very hard to have access to cases, to stories, because I know how emotional and important it is to share stories. I try to say that to mention the practices that can help and would help people on death row, women on death row, especially in such countries with limited access to data. As according to our experience, we have indirect documentation and independent investigations with families, with family members, victims' families, with even prisoners that are friends of someone who is in death row. And this is one of the most ways that we have succeeded in getting data on. Also, monitoring and analyzing the official publications, even if it's limited, it's always good to have a good analyzing and share it with the UN mechanisms, because UN special procedures, as you said, the SIDA working groups are a good focal point that we can get communication with the states as Saudi Arabia, so that we can get responses or no responses, so that it is some evidence of the lack of transparency. Also, cooperation with partner organizations and making such allies, as you said, with, for example, the organizations that are members of the working group, especially with the countries of the people who are in death row, women in death row, for example, Ethiopian women, Pakistanis citizens. We are trying to get in touch with daily and basically with organizations from these countries that could have access for victims in their home countries. When we talk about gender specifically, highlighting structural discrimination against women in general that can be implied in women in death row, especially when we don't have access to specific stories. Also, mentioning the group of women, mothers, victims of domestic violence, pregnant and women, and so as a target to defend also, especially when we raise with the UN mechanisms. And also, I'm just when I hear the stories of people on death row and examples, I think that it's the most important to reach for more stories and to document more stories. And thank you, Madam, for this opportunity.
Thank you a lot. And as a last question, and if there are questions to the floor, I know there is an side event, so we can also be in the front of the room to ask any question you may have. But I would like to ask Suzanne about the work you are doing with the International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women, and if you could share with us some good practices in why and how is it important to engage with people with lived experience. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Meline. The International Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women is a global organization of formerly incarcerated women that aims to build solidarity with currently and formerly incarcerated women and girls, their families, and allies. What do we do? As a member, I'm happy to explain our work. We raise awareness about the global increase in women incarceration rates, its effects on their children and communities, and the need for alternative solutions. It's an advocacy platform for policy changes and reforms to address systemic injustices faced by women in the criminal justice system, promoting abolitionist approaches. It supports formerly incarcerated women's reintegration back to society through building connections between organizations and individuals worldwide, fostering solidarity among formerly incarcerated women and their allies. It does research and create reports and develop resources to educate the public about issues surrounding women incarceration and provide evidence-based solutions. Why is it important for formerly incarcerated women or women with lived experience to be involved in the criminal justice system for policy programming and advocacy? Women with lived experience bring variable perspective on the challenges and barriers faced by women in the criminal justice system. They can identify systemic problems and potential solutions that might not be apparent to others. They can help develop targeted solutions addressing specific needs and challenges. Involving them ensures that policies are informed by those most affected. They amplify the voices of those still incarcerated, bringing attention to critical issues. Their involvement can help break down stigma and promote understanding. They can help provide support and guidance for women reintegration into society. This empowers communities and promotes social change. Their involvement can help assure that human rights are respected and protected. They can help address systemic injustices and promote social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Suzanne. And I think it's time to close because we really want to respect the time for other colleagues. But if there are any questions, we're going to be there right in front of the room and would be very happy to answer a question. And I want to really thanks again these all very brilliant panelists and also colleagues attending at distance. And thank you for joining.